Welcome to Lesson 3. This week you have a very short chapter to read. Chapter 19 is called Arguing, and in this chapter the authors of your textbook present the basic strategies for making arguments in writing. I will also provide additional information on how your essays should be structured from here on out. More specifically, today I'll be covering introductions, thesis statements, body paragraphs, and conclusions. I will also briefly talk about plagiarism. Let's begin by talking about introductions. In his book, Writing with Style, Conversations on the Art of Writing, John R. Trimble gives a wonderful analogy concerning the importance of an introduction, which I'll share now. Imagine that you're sitting in a waiting room at your doctor's office. You pick up National Geographic because you could be called back at any moment. You're anxious to find an article that'll help you pass the time. And Trimble states, since you're hungry for something good and you're expecting your name to be called, you're ruthless. You give each story maybe 3 sentences to prove itself, and that's all. But experience or impatience has convinced you it's enough. In that brief span, your mind answers probably all of these questions. Does the story attract me enough to read on? Is the writing easy, or will I have to work here? Is the style fresh or just so-so? Does the writer seem smart, well-informed, spirited? So it goes with everything you read. The problem is, though, you as a writer are subject to the very same testing. You, too, will generally be given only 3 or 4 sentences to prove yourself. And what you want to prove is that you're writing with conviction, you know what you're talking about, and you're not going to waste your readers' time. When I studied at community college, I was enrolled in a speech class and I was so nervous. Talking in front of my class terrified me. Above all else, I think one of my greatest concerns was that I didn't want to be boring. I didn't want to go up there and just see rows and rows of zoned out faces. So I was determined to find the most interesting topic out there, and I found this news article about this man who wanted to preserve his brain after he died and put it in a robot to live on. You know, it was the closest thing to eternal life that he could think of. Little did he know that he could have just accepted Jesus into his heart, but that's not the point of this story. So anyway, the day of my presentation, I'm giving my spiel, and what do you know, I'm looking out at my audience, and with every minute that passes, I see one zoned face after another. And at the end of my presentation, I was sad, confused, discouraged, because I was convinced that I had picked a topic that would intrigue them. And so for my next speech, I had the same trouble trying to find a topic. And I don't even know how I arrived at this idea, but I talked to my class about reading programs in elementary schools, and I included a cute picture of my nieces and nephew, and I talked about how I loved reading books with them. And everyone in the class was oohing and aahing about how cute my nieces and nephew were and how they had been involved in reading programs when they were younger. And I remember after I finished presenting being amazed at how receptive everyone was to my speech, and I came to realize that people want to connect. And people can sense when you write about things that you don't believe in or when you write about things that you don't know. In academic writing, it's not appropriate to make your writing about yourself, but that doesn't mean that you still can't write with your heart. Find a way to write about things that you care about. And once you find a subject that you care about, then you'll be that more willing to do the research to get to the point where you know your stuff. And when you know your stuff, you're able to cut the fluff and speak directly to your audience, which means that you're not going to waste their time dancing around an issue because you don't really know how to approach it. And that's why your introduction is so important. In fact, it's your first opportunity to make a good first impression. But who are you trying to impress? Obviously, you want to demonstrate to your professor that you understand and can follow the instructions provided in the prompt. Still, I strongly suggest that you not be solely motivated by the particular grade you want to earn. Although it is obviously important to think about your professor's requirements while you write, you should also have a greater audience in mind, even if you don't plan on sharing your essay with other people. You'll also notice that the structure of your introduction should resemble a funnel. This funnel has 3 parts. First, you'll want to begin with a broad overview of your topic. We, the readers, want to know what you're writing about. Secondly, you'll want to get a little more specific and perhaps provide some background information that eventually leads to the final part of your introduction, which is your thesis statement. Although your introduction should begin broad, you'll want to avoid sweeping generalizations like "since the beginning of time" statements. That's a little too broad. Any of the information that you provide here should be relevant to your topic. For instance, if you are writing on Romeo and Juliet, you would not want to include irrelevant details about Shakespeare's life, like what he loved to eat for dinner, simply because he's the author of that play. It's also important that the information you provide is interesting, and as I just mentioned, a successful introduction will immediately grab your reader's attention and convince them that your essay is worth reading. You'll also want to remember that you should never begin your argument in your introduction. Although you will present your argument at the end of your intro in your thesis statement, you will need to save your true argument for your body paragraphs. According to Corinne Pratt's How to Write a Good Introduction, a good test to see if information should go in a body paragraph or an introductory paragraph is to ask yourself a few questions, such as, is this providing context or evidence? Does this introduce my argument or try to prove it? True evidence or proof deserves a body paragraph. Context and background most likely belong in your introduction. The context and background information that you include in your introduction should all lead up to your thesis statement, which is the last sentence or sentences in your introduction. Please pay attention to the word "in" here. So many students make the mistake of writing their introduction and then leaving their thesis statement out of it. The two belong together. Do not separate them. I also want to explain to you what a thesis statement is. First, a thesis statement is not your subject. It's your take on your subject. And it's what you'd have us, your readers, think and feel about it too. For example, right now the subject I'm talking about is thesis statements. And my take is that if you want to succeed as a writer, you must make your thesis statement your number one priority. And I want you to look at your thesis statement as you would your own child. I want you to nourish it, encourage it, and make sure it has the space to grow up and become a strong, healthy, and confident adult who has something to offer the world, or in this case, your readers. Before you start writing, you need a thesis statement, specifically a working thesis statement. A working thesis statement doesn't mean that you need to know exactly where you're going in your essay, but it will help you find your way. I know so many students who can write an entire essay, and when you ask them to point out their thesis statement, they either don't know if they have one or they have trouble finding it. And this is exactly what we want to avoid, because if you can't communicate your position on a subject, then how can you ever expect your readers to connect with your message? But here's the thing. Writing is a learning tool. You might go into an essay thinking you want to convince your audience that people should watch less television, but then as you begin to write, you realize that your real beef is with reality TV. And so when you come to that point where you realize you've made a left turn, it's important to evaluate if that left turn is worth exploring, or have you just got lost along the way. And if the left turn is worth exploring, then you'll simply revise your thesis to reflect your new argument. But if you realize that you've gotten sidetracked, then you know to keep your thesis and to simply trim those parts that would now be considered excess. The next point that I want to make is that your thesis statement should also include a roadmap for your readers where you tell them upfront how you plan to organize your essay. It's very similar to the public speaker who previews his 3 main points at the beginning of his speech. Particularly in academic settings, we want to alert our readers to our most important points because we recognize that they're trying to learn. And it helps people stay focused and stay grounded when they have checkpoints along the way. And if this doesn't make total sense now, just hang tight. I do give you examples of thesis statements for each of the essays that you'll write over the course of the semester. Now that you have a basic understanding of what a thesis statement is, I want to talk to you about the 3 standards your thesis must satisfy. First, your thesis must be arguable. Secondly, your thesis must be clear. Finally, your thesis must be appropriately qualified. We'll take a closer look at these 3 standards over the next few slides. I found this really awesome quote by Trimble that explains what it means for a thesis to be arguable, and I'll read that quote now. A good thesis is above all arguable, that is, not everyone will agree with it, but please understand that it won't necessarily concern a right or wrong issue. Often it will concern whether something is urgent or not urgent, interesting or not interesting, a good way to do something or a not so good way to do something, and can we achieve this issue or can we not achieve this issue? Whatever your position, it should involve some conviction, preferably bold, that even skeptics will approach with curiosity, if only to see how biased, benighted, boring you'll prove to be. Your job, of course, is to convince them otherwise. That is always the grand challenge in writing, isn't it? To bring people around, to teach them, amuse them, inspire them, goad them, charm them, awaken them, convince them. And one of the ways we bring people around is through our use of clear and precise wording. The tricky part about using clear and precise wording is that your wording will almost always make sense to you because it came from your brain. And that's why you will need to be conscious of the fact that everyone processes information differently. And you'll need to think and place yourself in your reader's shoes. Think about all those times where you've sent a text message that wasn't received the way you intended. Written messages can often get lost in translation because the reader can't see your facial expressions or hear the tone of voice that you're using. When thinking about writing a thesis that's clear and precise, you should also consider the connotations of the words you use. A connotation is an idea or feeling that a word invokes in addition to its literal or primary meaning. For instance, the word religion can stir up positive feelings for one person and negative feelings in another. For example, when a person thinks about the word religion, she might be reminded of the precious traditions that have been passed down in her family for generations. Therefore, for her, the word religion invokes feelings of comfort, whereas the same word might remind someone else of the times he felt bogged down by the rules and regulations of religion, and for him, the word religion might invoke feelings of failure and resentment. And that's why it's so important to clarify any abstract terms like freedom, goodness, or success, and to avoid vague and ambiguous language that can be interpreted several ways. Finally, the last standard regarding your thesis statement that needs to be addressed is appropriate qualification. If you create an arguable thesis, you are also opening the door for someone to disagree with you. And you'll need to think about whether or not your readers will be readily accepting of your argument or if they will challenge the claims that you make. And if you're discussing something particularly controversial, you may need to qualify your thesis in order to make your readers more likely to take your essay seriously. Basically, that means that you won't be speaking in absolutes. Instead, you will use qualifying expressions like probably, very likely, apparently, or it seems. Still, I would encourage you to be careful when using qualifying expressions because you don't want your writing to appear unsure or diffident. Even if you're asserting an unpopular opinion, don't be afraid to confidently assert your convictions with reason and logic. Now that we've addressed thesis statements, it's time to talk about body paragraphs, specifically the meal plan. The meal plan stands for main idea, evidence, analysis, and length. The idea is that you will serve your readers a complete meal by following this acronym. So let's start with the M portion of the meal plan. As I've said, the M stands for main idea. Every body paragraph that you write should only have one main idea, and I can't stress this enough. If any of your body paragraphs have more than one main idea, that paragraph will need to be revised. Your main ideas should appear in the very first sentences of each of your body paragraphs, and this sentence is called a topic sentence. I like to compare it to the body paragraph's mini thesis statement because all of the subsequent sentences should support the topic sentence just like your body paragraphs support your thesis statement. And if you have trouble identifying the main idea of a body paragraph, try writing this paragraph is about blank. And ultimately, you'll want to cross out the phrase this paragraph is about in order to improve the topic sentence's clarity. Let's look at the examples that I have on this slide. The first topic sentence reads, this paragraph is about why Stillman is a better superhero than Green Muscle. The second example states, this paragraph is about why is Stillman a better superhero than Green Muscle. Finally, the third example states, Stillman's ingenuity makes him a better superhero than Green Muscle because this quality allows him to reason and make decisions based on his intellectual abilities. And notice the difference between the first example and the final example. The final topic sentence is narrow and focused, whereas the first topic sentence is not. It would be very difficult to prove that one superhero was superior to another superhero in only one paragraph. Instead, in the third example, the writer is focusing on one of Stillman's specific characteristics to address this topic. This is a much more manageable sub-argument to tackle in a single paragraph. Now that a major claim or main idea has been asserted, it's time to provide evidence, that's the E in the meal plan, that supports that major claim or main idea. If you assert that Stillman's ingenuity makes him a better superhero, you must provide specific examples that highlight that Stillman's decisions are based on brains rather than brawn. For instance, you might refer to a specific scene where Stillman uses science to outsmart his enemy. After your main idea has been stated and supported, it is time to move on to the third letter in the meal plan, which is analysis. A lot of students struggle with the analysis portion of the meal plan because they often feel that their evidence speaks for itself. For instance, let's say that the main idea you want to talk about is the love of God. In order to support your claim that God is loving, you find several verses in the Bible that highlight that love. You might cite Romans 5:8, which states, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Now, the problem arises when you find a great piece of evidence and you think to yourself, wow, there's nothing more for me to say. Let me tell you, there is always more for you to say. Your evidence needs to be broken down for your readers. In this case, you might talk about how there have been many people in this world who have sacrificed their lives for someone they love or for a cause they believe in, but God's love goes a million steps further. God the Father sacrificed his beloved Son to save a wicked and rebellious people. Such an act goes against human instinct. As humans, we might die for something we deem good, but when do we ever willingly die for those who have cursed and rejected us? This is the type of analysis that you want to provide for your readers. The last component of the meal plan is the L, which stands for link. Basically, the last sentence of each of your body paragraphs should serve as a transition from one main idea to the next main idea. Your link or transition aids the flow and clarity of your writing. Sometimes writing a strong link takes some creativity. For instance, if you just finished talking about God's love and now you want to talk about God's holiness, you have to think about how those two things relate to one another. Now that we've addressed the structure of your individual body paragraphs, I now want to talk to you about counter-arguing, which is an important aspect of every argumentative essay. And that's because in an argumentative essay, you're asserting your opinion, but we all know that there are a million different opinions to hold in this world, especially as Christians. The big biblical truths we hold often don't align with the wisdom of the world. Therefore, whenever you assert your position on a topic, you have to think about how your audience will react to the views that you hold. You must anticipate their objections and questions that might arise as your readers digest your essay. You also want to address these objections and/or questions head-on, demonstrating to your readers that you're able to look at a subject from multiple angles and that you care about their concerns. And as you address a potential objection to your argument, it's okay if you agree or partially agree with the opposing side's point of view. This can demonstrate that you're doing your best to be unbiased and sympathetic to all parties. However, you can't always accommodate to your readers' objections. If you must refute them, that's perfectly okay. Just remember to do so respectfully. Think about a Christian's stance on abortion. A Christian might argue that the United States should be pro-life. However, that same Christian may also acknowledge that they understand how difficult it may be for a young girl who has no job, who has no support from the father of her child, or simply lacks the maturity to keep a baby she doesn't feel ready to have. And this doesn't mean that that Christian is any less pro-life, but it does show his readers that he's not only concerned with the unborn children, but he also cares about the girls and women who find themselves wrestling with conflicting convictions. And the final component of your essay that I want to address is the conclusion. I commonly find that the weakest portion of most students' essays are their conclusions. And students typically view their body paragraphs as the meat of their essays. Therefore, when they finish writing those body paragraphs, they suddenly feel that their work is done, and as a result, they slap on a quick conclusion and call it a day. But that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a writer. Earlier on in this lesson, we addressed how important a first impression is, but let's not forget that a last impression is just as important and maybe even more important. And think about when you go to the movies. A movie may have a killer opening scene that immediately captures your attention. And as the movie continues, you're totally enthralled, you're connected to the characters, and you can't wait to find out what happens to the lead. But then all of a sudden, the movie starts slowing down. You start to experience some boredom, and finally the ending makes no sense. It's simply not believable. And when you walk out of that theater, it doesn't matter how great that movie started out because the movie ended terribly. And you can't help but feel that you wasted your time and you wasted your money, and you're going to give that movie one big thumbs down. But I want you to think about what happens when the opposite occurs. A movie might start out slow and it may seem uninteresting at first, but if it picks up steam and provides an ending that blows your mind and radically exceeds your expectations, you'll likely be forgiving of that movie's slow start. And when your friends ask if you liked the movie, you're probably going to give that movie a thumbs up. And let me tell you, the same will be true for your essay. The conclusion is your last chance to convince your readers that your writing is worth reading, although you've hopefully established that fact already. And I love the two quotes pictured on this slide. What kind of athlete sees the finish line and slows down? You might be writing for a grade or to fulfill a course requirement to graduate, but don't forget that your writing can be an act of worship. I hope that you take pride in your work and perform to the best of your ability. And as the other quote states, starting strong is good, but finishing strong is epic. It's easy to be excited about a diet or a new exercise routine or a new art project when you first start out, but it takes a special type of person to press on when the initial motivation and enthusiasm has since gone. But let me tell you, it is rewarding when you produce a paper that you have given your all. Now that I've addressed why strong conclusions matter, let's now talk about how to construct a solid conclusion practically. A common misconception that most students have is that a conclusion is simply a summary. And conclusions can offer a summary of one's paper, but that typically occurs with lengthy papers. The essays in this class are relatively short, so you don't need to worry about your readers forgetting your content by the time they reach the end of your essay. Instead of recapping your entire paper, you simply want to restate your thesis and your conclusion. Remember that your thesis is a sort of anchor for your paper. Above all else, your thesis is what you are continually striving to drive home. And after you have restated your thesis for the final time, you should now feel confident that you've said what you've needed to say about your topic. Now it's time to redirect your focus to what many professors refer to as the so what. Your readers may think, okay, you've made your point, but why should I care? And a couple lessons ago, we talked about how a person may decide to write an essay about helping the homeless. A hypothetical reader may think, you know what, there is a need to help the homeless, but why should I use my resources to help that particular population? And your conclusions should seek to answer that question. In the next lesson, lesson 4, we're going to learn how to explain different or unfamiliar concepts. And the sample student essay in next week's reading attempts to explain what cannibalism is. And he breaks this concept down into 3 parts. Although the student's essay is logically organized and easy to follow, I wonder about the author's purpose. Obviously, he's trying to inform his readers about cannibalism, but I want to know why I, or any of his other readers, should care about cannibalism in the first place. And I encourage you to skim his essay and read his conclusion on page 135. Do you think he adequately answers the so what question? As you ponder the answer to that question, I would like you to think about how you will make your writing relevant to your readers. What bigger picture do you want to paint? In other words, what do you want your readers to think about long after they finish reading your essay? Now let's talk about plagiarism. In the majority of your college classes, you'll be required to use outside sources to support the ideas in your writing. And plagiarism occurs when you fail to acknowledge the sources that you've used. You should cite your sources correctly because you want to give credit where credit is due. Also, your readers will appreciate those citations because it'll give them an opportunity to view the original source themselves. Perhaps your readers want to learn more about the topic you're addressing or the original context of the cited material. You should also know that citing sources correctly takes time. In fact, it typically takes way longer than you anticipate. You'll want to gather the information you will need for your bibliography as soon as possible. This means that you will need to familiarize yourself with the updated CCBC style guide. Know that you only add to your struggles when you wait until the very last minute to write your bibliography. When you are rushing against the clock, it's tempting to think that acknowledging your outside sources doesn't matter, but it does. I also want to note that although most students know that they must cite their sources when they are quoting a text directly, you'll also need to cite your sources when you're paraphrasing or summarizing, and both of those we covered in Lesson 1. Another topic I would like to cover is the use of in-text quotations. Perhaps you have a textbook or you've read an essay that uses a lot of direct quotations. If quotations are used too frequently, and if they are too long in length, they can actually do more damage than good. As I've mentioned before, we all have unique voices as writers, and it can be distracting for readers if they encounter too many voices in one text. Sometimes if a text has too many direct quotations, readers will simply skip over them because they want to read a text that has a consistent and a continuous flow. And for that reason, I encourage you to smoothly integrate your quotations into the language of your essay. I have a few examples of what I mean on this slide. For instance, a quote can be placed at the beginning of your sentence. For example, Solomon was handed great opportunities but didn't make the most of them, demonstrating that a crown does not guarantee success. A quote can also be placed in the middle of a sentence. Murray ends the chapter by asking his readers to look up into the face of the Father so that they might be filled with God's Spirit. Finally, a quote can be placed at the end of a sentence. In absolute surrender, how to walk in perfect peace. Andrew Murray describes the Christ life to be a continuous proof that God works impossibilities. Another thing to note about this third example is that the writer not only uses a direct quotation, but she also introduces the title of the source and the author's full name, and this is something you will want to do the very first time you use a source in your essay. If you use the same source again later on in your essay, leave out the long introduction. This concludes Lesson 3, Beginning to Write. I encourage you to print out the meal plan handout or at least have that tab open whenever you sit down to write any of your upcoming essays. I also challenge you to assess where you need the most growth in regards to essay writing, and I want you to think about how you can use your writing to love God and other people better. Have fun writing this week.